Okay, well, I'm happy to be here and talk about my favorite project. I have a handout here which I'll pass around, and let me keep on. There are lots of topics here, and I'll get to that in a moment. The Age of the World picture, appendix number 6, page 142 of our translation here. Value is the objectification of needs as goals wrought by a representing self-establishing within the world as picture. Value appears to be the expression of the fact that we, in our position of relationship to it, act to advance just that which is itself most valuable. And yet that very value is the impotent and threadbare disguise of the objectivity of whatever is. An objectivity that has become flat and devoid of background. No one dies for mere values. Well, at first sight, that seems outrageous, because one would say, well, lots of people died for human dignity, freedom, justice, and so on. Don't people sacrifice their lives for values? And then I think when one thinks a step further back, one wants to say, well, maybe the situation is a little more complex. One doesn't really die for values, but rather one dies, let's say, because one thinks by sacrificing one's life, one can do something for the liberty of one's people at this moment. So it is, if it's just some act done in a vacuum, I would say this is not a noble act, it's an act of foolishness. But if it is done to further a cause in a real way, either through setting a symbol, making a symbolic act, or doing something actually and constructively to advance the freedom of one's people, then one is acting in a noble manner. So that acting is not from the mere value, one might say, certainly here, but it is rather out of a specific situation, considering the possibilities of that situation, and addressing some specific background and trying to transform what exists within that background. And I'll come back in a few moments to ask the question, why is that specification important, or how is that specification important for Heidegger and Heidegger's understanding of action? But I want to do two things, and the handout shows this. I want to situate this attack, this rather provocative statement, no one dies for mere values, in a somewhat larger context, in a historical context, and I want to spend a little time on that, and then I want to go back and ask this more general question: how does Heidegger see human action if he doesn't see it in terms of values and the pursuit of values? What are the alternatives? What are the problems here? Why the attack on values? Now, Heidegger talks about values in this negative fashion, not only in this text, but he, for instance, does the same thing even more extensively in the Introduction to Metaphysics, somewhat earlier from 1935, and maybe in a most sharpest, most pointed, most provocative fashion in the essay, The Word of Nietzsche, God is Dead. And so he keeps coming back to this theme, and it's clearly one of major philosophical interest to him. And I try to argue for this right here by saying that one reason is that the philosophy of value, as a worked out alternative view of the issues, was a prominent concern within Heidegger's own time. And so in order to kind of substantiate that, I have given you something here like an overview of the philosophy of value, pointing out that before the mid-19th century, the term value only occurred within economics, and we still have that meaning in the notion of monetary value. For instance, when we talk in this way, we are not talking about value in any other sense. But then Lotze in the 19th century begins to adopt it in philosophy and speaks of moral values and aesthetic values, the good and the beautiful as values, which are supposed to be, he says, objectively valid but inexistent. They have no reality, but they are nevertheless compelling. And that picture derives from a certain view of the natural world as science describes it to us, namely as a world of mere factuality in which is describable in a value and needs to be described in a value-free manner. So the world that science presents to us, the emerging science of the 19th century, is a value-free world. And hence, if we are to recognize any significance anywhere, it can't be by seeing value predicates instantiated in the world. Value has to be something else. It exists outside the world of being and is used by us in interpreting and understanding, making sense of the world. And so there evolves something like a metaphysics of value, which Lotze first sets out there in his metaphysics of 1841. And then it has a long history. Lotze is one of the originators, founding fathers of the neo-Kantian movement. And this theory of value becomes a kind of staple in neo-Kantianism. And I mentioned two names here in particular, namely Windelband and Ritter. Windelband is a direct student of London, and Ritter is a student of Windelband and a teacher of Heidegger's in Freiburg. So there is a direct linkage from Lotze and his first ideas about value and the need to postulate values as objectively valid but non-existing things to Heidegger himself. But in this transition from Lotze to the neo-Kantian, value theory gets transformed, and now the claim is not only that these values are valid objectively, but that they are existent or real, so that there can be such a thing as an ontology of value. And so metaphysics now takes on the task of describing what the nature of values is. And Windelband works this out in a number of writings. The latest one is this Introduction to Philosophy of 1911. And he adds to the aesthetic and the moral values the idea that truth is a third value. I have in some other writings have shown that Frege actually appropriates this neo-Kantian and Windelbandian notion, so that when he speaks of truth values, the true and the false as values, he really means that in the neo-Kantian fashion, and he says of the truth values that they are objective but inexistent. So he is speaking exactly the language of the time. So you could say this is connected out here, Frege, with the truth values, right? And then there arises really a very different strand of concern with values in the same period in the 19th century, quite independent of this, namely Nietzsche, who takes on the early debate of objective values, and of course, as we know, attacks it in Beyond Good and Evil of 1887, and then finally in these late notes that are published in 1911 under the title of The Will to Power, he attacks this doctrine of objective value, and he says it really devalues things, it devalues the world. We have to see that values are human creations, and that our task is constantly to create new values, that our old values, particularly this belief in an objective set of values, in a divinely appointed set of values, we might say, is false, has become devalued, and hence a radical destruction of existing values is called for, and a revaluation of all values. So in some sense, he's a critic of value philosophy, but by creating a value theory of his own. And we'll see that this is important for Heidegger, because Heidegger, in attacking values, is not only attacking this Lotzian neo-Kantian tradition, he is equally attacking Nietzsche. He is as much a critic of the Nietzschean subjectified or relativized value theory as he is a critic of the objective value theory. Well, there is a third strand of this, which really derives from Husserl and phenomenology, namely in Max Scheler, who had originally studied with one of the German idealists, Rudolf Eucken in Vienna, but then got influenced by Husserl, and he began to write a critical kind of work on Kantian ethics, formalist ethics, and opposed to that what he called a material value ethic. And material value ethics argued that there are indeed objective values, that they really do exist, and that they are not only the three values of the good, the true, and the beautiful, but that there is a whole hierarchy, a whole complex array of values, and that the task of philosophy should be to describe systematically what that hierarchy is, and that we can know what this hierarchy is through a direct, a Wertschau, a kind of a priori intuition of values. And so Max Scheler, in a book of 1,000 pages, lays out in 1913 to 16 this objective value theory. Well, Heidegger is quite close to Scheler and has a great deal of respect for him. And so Scheler's work on value theory is again important to him. It gets Scheler's work gets further elaborated, I say here, by Nikolai Hartmann in the 1920s in a book called Ethics. He again describes this complex hierarchy of values, arguing that knowledge of value is genuine knowledge of being, he says. And hence, the theory of value has to be seen as part of metaphysics or ontology. We are describing this objective realm of the world when we're doing ethics. Hartmann is in the 1920s and early 30s just as famous, as perhaps more famous in Germany, and more respected than Heidegger. And Heidegger often speaks of him as a kind of competitor. He sees himself sort of in a kind of struggle with Hartmann, and that surely contributes also to his preoccupation with values and what's wrong with values. Well, the final, Hartmann to some extent is also influenced by these neo-Kantians, when he really comes out of the reform scale of the final descendant of all these is a man by the name of Bruno Bauch, who was a student of Rickert again. And Bauch in 1941 writes a book called Truth, Value, and Reality, which is of the last final classical exposition of this objective value theory. Bauch is also an organizer, and in the 1920s and 30s, and in 1933 gets himself deeply involved with the Nazis, trying to get his own value theoretical views established as the official philosophy of National Socialism, and arguing in articles that Nazi racism and anti-Semitism can only be grounded on an objective theory of values. Otherwise, the notion of racial inferiority would be merely subjective. And so you need the theory of objective values to be a National Socialist. And those who criticize many Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Heidegger get mentioned, they are nihilists because they deny values and thereby undermine National Socialism. They are the enemies of National Socialism. You can see why Heidegger in the 1930s, after 33, would have yet another reason for making quite clear what it is he is holding. And what we'll see, he will argue, is that it's not the denial of values that is nihilistic, but the theory of values itself. So he tries to turn the table on Bauch and his associates by arguing that the theory of values is exactly what is wrong. So that much for this general historical sketch. And if you want to ask any questions or have any comments or whatever, maybe on this historical point, this is the moment. You have read all these works I referred to, I'm sure. But anyway, I'm supposed to just give you a kind of sense of that Heidegger is not speaking here to a vacuum, but he is addressing a powerful philosophical movement, and he has all kinds of reasons for taking that on and taking that seriously, partly because he has been taught by people who believe this, right? Partly he is relating himself to philosophers who believe in value theory. Partly he sees them as competitors. Partly he gets attacked politically for his denial of values. So there's a whole slew of reasons why this is a major concern for him. And I'll get back to that. So what I would like to do, and what I really want to spend most of the time on, is something else, and it's saying that though Heidegger, in this critique of values, in this repeated critique of values, is really focusing to some extent on this specific historical movement and what's wrong with it, there lies behind it a much more general critique, which has nothing to do with value theory specifically, but which is directed against the belief that there are absolute or objective eternal norms, moral or otherwise, according to which we should act or can act. And that he has that wider target, for instance, becomes clear in the Introduction to Metaphysics, where he attacks value theory, but where he describes the rise of value theory as having its origins in the Platonic theory of ideas. So we can go back all the way to Plato and his belief in the true and the good and the beautiful as absolutes that really underlie what Heidegger is intent on criticizing. Now, in many places, he does not say that much about, in many of these texts, he doesn't speak much about human action, of how we should see human choice. But one place, of course, where he does talk about this, and one needs to refer to, is Being and Time. And so I have excerpted here on the second page a few passages from Being and Time, and I've taken the liberty of changing the Macquarie Robinson translation, sometimes just small changes that are really insignificant, but as you will see, there's one passage where I really go all the way and change it in a radical fashion, because I think only then can one really see what he's driving at. So let me look at the first one. This Dasein's lostness in the day, the one, this man, that practical potentiality for being which is closest to it has already been decided upon. So when Dasein is lost to this anonymous one, then what is closest for it in some sense has already been decided upon. And then in parentheses, he spells out what that closest is, that, as he said, the tasks, rules, and standards, the urgency and extent of concern for unsolicitous being in the world. So one of the things that the one has already determined for us when we are lost in it are rules and standards. That is, it gives us our standards and rules for action, and then we just implement them and we act according to them. But that's being inauthentic. The they even, or the one even, hides the manner in which they tacitly relieve Dasein of the burden of explicitly choosing these possibilities, and of explicitly choosing which rules, standards, tasks, urgency, concern for kinds of being, and so on, it wants to make its own. So among these are, so Dasein makes no choices, gets carried along by the nobody, and thus ensnares itself in authenticity. So the authentic Dasein then presumably is expected to choose these things that are closest to it, namely to choose among other things its rules and standards, which does not mean that it has to make them up out of nowhere, presumably, but at least it has to reflect on the rules and standards that are presented to it by its social context, and decide on whether it's going to make those its own or not. So at some point or other, there has to be a choice of Dasein if it is to be authentic, a choice with respect to rules and standards. And now the choosing to choose a kind of being oneself, that is the choosing of being authentic, that is the facing of these choices, is to be called resoluteness. And of this resoluteness now, Heidegger says in the third passage, resoluteness exists only as a resolution which understandingly projects itself. But on what basis does Dasein disclose itself in resoluteness? On what is it to resolve? So, we are supposed to be resolute, but in respect to what, right? In what direction? Only the resolution can give the answer. Yes. There is no fixed and given target for resoluteness. It's only the act of resolving that can give the answer on what Dasein is to resolve itself on. One would completely misunderstand the phenomenon of resoluteness if one should want to suppose that this consists simply in taking up possibilities which have been proposed and recommended and seizing hold of them. So that's exactly the inauthentic form of choice, where you just take whatever is recommended and proposed to you and you act on that. Rather, the resoluteness is precisely the disclosive projection and determination of what is practically possible at the time. So there has to be some kind of projection and determination of what is possible, and that involves a choice among these possibilities. Indeterminacy, which characterizes every potentiality into which Dasein has been practically thrown, is something that necessarily belongs to resoluteness. Resoluteness is necessarily indeterminate in the sense that it has no prefix or given or determinate, absolutely determinate target. It has no objectively or socially determined rules and standards. Only in a resolution is resoluteness sure of itself. The existential indeterminacy of resoluteness, which makes itself determinate only in the resolution, has nevertheless its existential determinacy. So, in some sense, resoluteness is indeterminate, but it's indeterminate in the rules, in the actual concrete rules and standards, we could say, that we adopt or do not adopt, that we are confronted with. There we have a choice, but there nevertheless is an existential determinacy. And I think that is an important distinction for Heidegger to make, since he is often accused, on the basis of his views about human choice and human resoluteness, of being a decisionist or a pure decisionist. And by that is meant a view according to which, so to say, the human Dasein chooses blindly and arbitrarily, that in some sense all choices are arbitrary, and you just choose one thing rather than another, and then you make another choice, and maybe you base that on some rule or principle you have previously accepted, but that at the beginning of all human choices are some arbitrary commitment, and that what really matters is not what you do or how you do it, but that you commit yourself in some fashion or other. That commitment itself, or decision itself, rather than its content, is what matters. Since that kind of decisionism is often associated with Nazism, rightly or wrongly historically, then it's easy to make a bridge at this point and argue that Heidegger's involvement with the Nazis was simply due to this identification with Nazi decisionism. So he is a decisionist, the Nazis are decisionists, no wonder they got together like that. And I want to argue certainly that Heidegger is not a decisionist in the sense in which that argument proposes, and that this insistence on existential determinacy makes quite clear that his choices are not to be arbitrary or contentless. I would also want to argue on this by the side that this was really also the way the Nazis thought, so that it wasn't just arbitrarily deciding to be anti-Semitic or not, but they had a definite commitment to being anti-Semitic, right? Now, in the existential analysis, next remark now, we cannot in principle schematize what Dasein practically resolves in any particular case. So that is the existential indeterminacy. Practically, we can't say what Dasein will do. We can't say it ought to do this now or that now, concretely. Nevertheless, we must ask whence in general, that's now talking about the existential determinism, whence in general Dasein can draw those possibilities upon which it practically projects itself. And this now gets spelled out. This is section 74 of Being and Time, in a detailed fashion, but in one that is deeply bewildering and that has drawn once again the accusation that Heidegger is prefiguring here Nazi ideology. He says here that the interpretation of Dasein which he will offer in this section is meant to be just a more concrete working out of what he has already said about temporality. And so you expect him to be very detailed and concrete. But that is a part of the problem of this passage, that it still remains at a great level of abstraction. And the very terms in which he defines this or tries to define this, these possibilities for authentic resoluteness, remain very contentious, and I'll try to argue this in a moment in relation to this next passage. And that's the one where I really substantially altered the Macquarie Robinson translation. Dasein is indeed thrown to itself and delivered over to its potential for being. That is the existential indeterminacy, the fact that Dasein must choose to choose itself, right? That's what we're talking about. Dasein is indeed thrown to itself and delivered over to its potential for being, but yet as being in the world. And so the fundamental condition which constrains or makes sense of human choices is the fact that this thrown Dasein always finds itself already as being in the world. As thrown, it depends on the world and exists practically with others. The resoluteness in which Dasein comes back to itself discloses current practical possibilities of authentic existence. So by finding these conditions of resoluteness, the conditions of possibility, we discover current practical possibilities of authentic existence. That is, what it is possible to be authentically at a given moment. You can't be not every possible behavior can be authentic at any given moment. That's roughly the implication. And discloses them in terms of the inheritance element of which that thrown resoluteness takes charge. And this is one important point where I have changed the translation, because our printed text speaks of a heritage which resoluteness takes over. That is, it passively sort of adopts for itself a heritage. And the word heritage, unlike the word inheritance, of course, has a very powerful positive value attached to it. And a heritage is something that you're supposed to value highly, whereas I think the term is really to be understood much more neutrally. It's that which you find yourself with in this concrete situation in which you are in the world and with others. You find yourself with certain givens, you might say, and those you don't just take over, übernehmen, but to ein Erbe übernehmen means to take charge of an inheritance, that is, to do something with it, right? And I think Heidegger is to be understood here in this much more active sense, that this Erbe is not simply something that you are meant to identify with and make your own as a result, but rather something that you transform or that you do something with at this point. The finitude of existence once grasped pulls one back from the endless multiplicity of possibilities. So theoretically, there is an endless multiplicity of possibilities of what one might do, but the finitude of existence, which means our being in the world at a particular moment with a particular group of others, it's that finitude which pulls one back from the endless multiplicity of possibilities which offer themselves as closest to one and brings Dasein into the simplicity of its lot, I say. Our text, the printed text, says Schicksal, fate. Is translated, and of course that is again a heavily loaded term. I'm going back all the way to the Greeks, right? But I think he is not talking about this here, but he's talking about Schicksal in a much more mundane sense, in which you have to accept the condition in which you find yourself, and one's lot is simply where one is, how one is, the circumstances under which one is, right? And I think one ought to understand Schicksal in this non-neutral fashion. But if allotted, Dasein as being in the world exists essentially in the being with others. It happens, geschehen, translated in our text incomprehensibly as historicism, It happens as a happening with. That is, Dasein happens as a happening with in its allotted condition, because it's always a being with others, happens as a happening with, and as determined for it as something set, Geschick. And again, here our text translates destiny, and again, it seems a much more loaded term, particular sense. The Nazis too like to talk about Germany's manifest destiny, and so it seems to kind of already prefigure Nazi terminology, but Geschick can be read in a much more neutral fashion as that which is sent to us, insofar as we find ourselves with it. In other words, for long. That is, namely, what is sent to us. Geschick is our name for the happening of a community, of a people. You find yourself with others in a certain social context, you could say. And what is sent as allotted to Dasein in and with its generation makes up the full, authentic happening of Dasein. You don't just find yourself in the world, you find yourself in the world with others, and these others form a group, namely a community of people. And you don't just find yourself with a people, so he's not here talking about the Germans as a nation, but you find yourself most specifically with a generation of these people, because you find yourself existing at a certain moment. So your choices, the choices one can make as a throne does, and the authentic choices are one can make a generational choice. And in a footnote to the text, which is reprinted, footnotes, as you know, are reprinted in the back, and therefore one doesn't read them. In the footnote, he refers us here to Dilthey, and Dilthey's discussion of generation as that central historical concept in which we really ought to understand historical phenomena, namely that the people who grew up in a certain period together have certain experience, they have a certain past in common, they have certain interests and needs in common, and so they form really a kind of a communal group. And history has to be understood as a generational history, as Dilthey says, and it's to that kind of idea that Heidegger is referring us to. Well, the problem with all of this is, of course, what it shows is that the choices that Dasein can authentically make are not arbitrary, they are not empty decisions. They are meant to be defined in terms of the generational needs and possibilities of human Dasein. But of course, that still only gives you sort of a range of possibilities, and it doesn't tell you which of these possibilities you should choose. So you could say, at the moment when Heidegger finds himself in 1933 in the political situation, what the generational situation tells you, that this is a time of great political and cultural emergency. And so you could, for instance, choose by joining the Nazis, but you could also join the Communist Party, presumably, and see this generational conflict as a struggle for international social justice. Or you could be a liberal, and there are many other options you could pursue. Presumably, the generational situation doesn't determine and is not meant to determine what kind of choices you make. So there is a kind of vacuum here, it seems to me. It shows, the account shows that choice is not arbitrary, but it doesn't tell you what else you then do once you have looked at these possibilities for authentic choosing. Right? And the next phase, I think, where he does try to say more about it, is after 33, and in the Introduction to Metaphysics in particular, and in some of the writings from that period. Let me see. The next quote, though, doesn't refer to that. So let me give you a couple of quotes. This is from a not yet published new translation of the text by Richard Pope and Gregory Freed, scheduled to come out. There is an early translation of Introduction to Metaphysics by Ralph Mannheim, which is very deficient, and so a new translation is appearing. And Heidegger is speaking here in the first chapter of the question of being, but also of the decline of the West, the flattening out of the world, the darkening of the earth, and so on. He speaks in very somber tones about the cultural and social and political environment, and we need to do something, we need to act, and so the question then is, of course, to do what, right? And he believes that it's not just a question of changing institutions anymore. The situation is so dire that we really have to go all the way back in our thinking and ask the most fundamental questions about ourselves and the world that we can. And of course, that gets him back to the question of being. That is the ultimate question to ask, and only by facing that question can one reverse that decline that is now in process. So, and he then writes, this is on page 29 of the original German text. To ask how does it stand with being? This means nothing less than to repeat and retrieve the inception of our historical spiritual Dasein in order to transform it into the other inception. So the way we now have to proceed, in which we have to act, is to repeat and retrieve the inception of our historical spiritual Dasein. We have to go back to the historical beginnings of our Western mode of thought and of our culture, and this means for Heidegger always to the early Greeks. So we have to go back to the early Greeks. That's the one thing. In order to transform it, we have to go back to this beginning, but transform it into the other inception. That is, we are not supposed to simply do kind of research into ancient philosophy and ancient culture, but we are supposed to use what we learn there not only to repeat and retrieve, but in order to transform what we find there, and to transform it in a certain direction, namely into another, and he will say in other places, into a more original inception. So the Greeks, in grounding and founding Western culture and Western philosophy, have engaged in a profoundly inventive act. And it's our task to act equally and even more profoundly and originally inventive at this moment. So this now defines, I think, more closely for him how we are supposed to choose given these possibilities of these various possibilities of action. It has to be a process of retrieval. We have to define ourselves in terms not only of the present situation of our generation, but of the deep past and of Greek thought, but we have to use that in order to bring about a radical and original, more original inception. Such a thing is possible. It is in fact the defining form of history because it has its outset in a happening which grounds history, that is early Greek culture. But an inception is not repeated when one shrinks back to it as something that once was. So it's not just a question of returning to the ancients. Something which by now is familiar and is simply to be imitated. We are not supposed to imitate the Greeks, but rather when the inception is begun again more originally, and with all the strangeness, darkness, insecurity that a genuine reception brings with it. Repetition, as we understand it, is anything but the ameliorating continuation of what has been by means of what has been. So in other words, we are not supposed to simply ameliorate our present cultural conditions of what has been in this present cultural conditions by going back to another past, namely the Greek past, and then adjusting in terms of that Greek. But what is called for is a more original inception with all the strangeness, darkness, and insecurity that brings with it. And he goes on to describe this in detail in this text. And here is another passage where he is talking about Oedipus and the myth of Oedipus as giving us a picture of how the Greeks struggle and how therefore we are meant to struggle. For the thinking of the early Greek thinkers, the unity and antagonism of being itself, he says, is antagonistic and seeming, were powerful in an originary way. So the Greeks really approached the world in an originary fashion. Yet all this was portrayed at its highest and purest in Greek tragic poetry. Let us consider Sophocles' Oedipus Rex. Oedipus, who at the beginning is the savior and lord of the state in the brilliance and glory and the grace of the gods, is hurled out of this seeming. This seeming is not merely Oedipus' subjective view of himself, but rather that within which the appearing of his Dasein happens. Finally, he is unconcealed in his being as murderer of his father and the defiler of his mother. The path from this beginning in brilliance to this end in horror is a unique struggle between seeming, concealment and distortion, and unconcealment, being. The city is besieged by what is concealed in the murder of the former King Lear. With the passion of one who stands in the openness of brilliance and who is a Greek, Oedipus goes to unveil what is concealed. In doing so, he must step by step place himself into an unconcealment, which in the end he can endure only by doubting out his own eyes. That is, by placing himself outside all light, letting the veil of night fall around him, and then by crying out as a blind man for all doors to be flung open so that such a man may become revealed to the people as the man who is. But we should not see, so this is a profoundly dark vision of Oedipus, right? He finally, having gouged out his eyes and blinded himself to the light, has the doors flung open and be brought into the light, has himself brought into the light and to be revealed to the people as the man who he is. And this is not, Heidegger wants to say here, a tragic failure, but that is really the moment of fulfillment of Oedipus' destiny. But we should not see Oedipus only as the human being who meets his downfall, he goes on. In Oedipus we must grasp that form of Greek Dasein in which this Dasein's fundamental passion ventures into what is wildest and most far-flung, the passion for the unveiling of being, that is the struggle concerning being itself. And in this text, Heidegger goes on to argue that what distinguishes the Greeks as a culture is this immense willingness to engage in this struggle to bring that being to appearance, to reveal being in themselves and in the world and in the polis, and all their works, the works of art and in the works of thought. And they do that as a struggle, because being itself, he goes on to say, that is a struggle. It's full of divisions and clefts, and it's full of tensions. And he quotes at this point Heraclitus. Polemos is the father of everything. And he said, Heraclitus is not speaking here simply of the human struggle, but he's talking here about the essence of being. He shows that being is struggle. And so the Greeks, by struggling with being in this radical fashion, in which Oedipus, for instance, is said to be here struggling with being, reveal bringing, make it appear, and in this consists their true greatness. And so the originary inception that we are called to perform now is meant to be a renewal of this struggle. And Heidegger's text itself is such a struggle because the Greeks, he says, are not the ones to be imitated here, but our task is to struggle with them, to confront them as the other, and thereby find out who we are by becoming original and inceptive ourselves. So you could call this a profoundly aesthetic conception of human action, right? As you could say, as the great artist considers the artwork of the past and clearly defines his own achievement in terms of that. You can't simply paint a great painting by never having seen one, or closing your eyes and forgetting and just doing something on canvas, right? That's not doing art. You define yourself as an artist in relation to what is already there. This determines the possibility of authentic artistic action. But at the same time, the artistic act is not one of imitation, but one of a struggle with that past, an attempt to transform it and to make it into a new and more original inception. And you have succeeded as a human being or as an artist when you have succeeded in that struggle, when you have made yourself more original. And Heidegger in the 1930s and 40s takes this up again, for instance, in his lectures with Hölderlin, where he says Hölderlin's great insight is the law of homecoming, that we have to leave behind who we are and what we are. We have to leave behind our home and go to the other and see that other as the other to us, and then return home and see ourselves in a new way. And only in that way can we overcome uncanniness, the Unheimlichkeit of the human condition, and find a home. And so in these texts, the other is first of all the Greeks, and Heidegger criticizes the Nazis for trying to see themselves as a new embodiment of Greek culture. He says the Greeks are not, the Nazis are not new Greeks. We have to see ourselves, the Greeks, as the other to the Germans. And Hölderlin is the other as well, through which one must go in order to find oneself culturally and philosophically. And in the introduction to metaphysics, it's Sophocles, the reading of Parmenides, the reading of Heraclitus. Each one of these texts that Heidegger reads in the 30s and 40s is for him the occasion for such an attempted originary struggle. Right? It's never meant to be an appropriation. That's why he keeps saying he's not doing philological interpretation. He is not after trying to just say what these people meant, but he is trying to get at something more profound. And at their struggle with being. Well, one might still feel this is the assimilation of human action in general, including presumably political and social action, to the act of artistic creativity, still leaves things much too indeterminate and much open to very questionable moves. I would say, if one is just something very radically strange and tries to force our culture, let's see, what happened in recent years, let's say in Cambodia, you could think of as an attempt by a great politician artist to wrench his culture away from something and make it into something radically new and achieve an originary inception. And we'd say it may be originary and an inception, but it's also profoundly worrying, right? And and there is nothing, it seems to me, that Heidegger offers in this account that would give us tools for a critique of this. Well, let me just turn to these last few quotes on the page. This is where he gets back to the question of value, and I have excerpted from Introduction to Metaphysics and Nietzsche's word, God is dead. The drawing of the division between the being and the ought, Heidegger says here, however, goes upwards. And he has said in Greek thinking, in Greek philosophizing with Plato and with the inception of idealist thought, being is grounded in thought, in thinking. And he says when one thinks of the ought, moral obligation or norms, when we talk about something that sort of goes upwards here, he draws a little diagram of this thought. The drawing of the division between the being and the ought, however, goes upwards. This suggests that being is surmounted by the ought. This is to say, being is no longer what is definitive, what provides the measure. So the idea is there is originally no division between being and the ought, and in the process of philosophy, beginning, I've left this out, but he talks about the theory of ideas next. In the theory of ideas, there already happens that division where value is posited as something that lies outside the temporal sphere, and the temple only partakes in part, incompletely and imperfectly in these values, in the ideas. And then he says this process, which has begun with Plato and the Platonic theory of ideas, this process is completed in Kant. For Kant, beings are nature. In other words, whatever can be determined and is determined in mathematical physical thinking. So being is just that, or beings are just those things that mathematical and physical science can describe. And it describes these things in a value-free manner. And hence, with this Kantian view of nature and of beings, any significance is taken out of the world, and the world is described as neutral or value-free. And if there is to be any value and significance, it's not going to be describable by empirical science, by description of what's real. It has to be found somewhere else, right? So the categorical imperative is opposed to nature. And what he means by this, that Kant, having described the natural world as one accessible fully to mathematical and physical thinking, therefore has to place the categorical imperative in a sphere outside nature, in transcendental consciousness. In the course of the 19th century, definitive precedence is attained by that which is, in Kant's sense, that which can be experienced according to the sciences. That is, this Kantian view of the natural world as fully explicated by mathematical and physical science in a value-free manner becomes the dominant view in which we still operate. Due to the predominance of beings, the art is endangered in its role as standard. And so the question is, are there any standards whatsoever? That now becomes the problem. And where would they be? The art must assert its claim. It must attempt to ground itself in itself. Values as such now become the ground of the art. So the reason why value philosophy, the one we have talked about, only appears in the 19th century in its fully formed fashion is due to the fact that only in the 19th century this mathematical and physicalistic value-free picture of the natural world is fully present, and now any art seems to kind of be undermined unless it's posited outside this mathematical and physical reality. Values as such now become the ground of the art. With the being of values, the maximum confusion and rootlessness has been reached. And the argument he puts forward for that is to say that once you have stripped being of any value, then you are not going to kind of introduce values or any kind of significance and meaning by saying, well, there is this other realm of being which natural science can't get hold of, and there reside these values, because if being has no value, then these values have no value. And so the appeal to values, these values will be just other posits, which you can then describe in a systematic theory of value, just as you can do a systematic theory of animal species, right? But it just becomes another value-free objective science, so to say, in the hands of Scheler and Hartmann. So values are not going to solve the problem either. And then he goes on to attack Nietzsche and saying that the problem is not resolved by denying just objective values, because even if these values are meant to be just human perspectives, you basically still thereby say that things themselves or being itself has no significance and value. So you still go on with this devaluation of being. In Nietzsche's words, God is death, he printed in this volume, Nietzsche recognizes that despite for the devaluing for the world of the highest values hitherto, the world remains. And he recognizes that above all the world becomes valueless, presses inevitably, the world becomes valueless, presses inevitably on towards a new positive of value. So this world, which is in itself valueless, will go on to posit new values, and this is due to the fact that the world is conceived as will to power, and that will to power will interpret the world and will impose on the world values, but none of that can restore the value of being, which has been lost. The will to power is, as soon as it comes expressly to appearance in its pure essence itself, the foundation of value positing, he says here. And then finally, if, however, value does not let being be being, which it doesn't, because it constantly says being has no value, and it's only either in terms of these outside objective values or these posited subjective value perspectives that we can recognize being in it. If value does not let being be being, then this supposed overcoming is above all the consummation of nihilism, because it still ends up with the conclusion that being by itself is without significance, meaning, and value. And so the philosophy of value, whether in the objectivized version or the Nietzschean version, is not overcoming the problem of how it stands to feel. Well, what is the answer? Well, it's not to talk about values, but rather to go back to what he had described, I think, in the introduction to metaphysics, mainly a confrontation with concrete possibilities of acting, and the polemical confrontation with these, and the attempt to transform these possibilities in an original fashion. That's what is left. But artists don't create values, they create works of art. And these works of art aren't objective standards to be imitated and appealed to, but rather they are just elements against which we can and must struggle to affirm ourselves in being. Okay, that's it. People will ask, but yes, of course. Okay. Oh, that's, yeah, okay. Yes. Yes. Okay. So confused on what I was listening to. Yeah, so we situate in the point with arbitrariness, no direction, between direction of value. And we put them in between them, or taking them out of this game by means of saying this confrontation with concrete possibilities, like you just said. And we mentioned some things before about our inheritance and generation, generational obligation, or something like that. You know, and as soon as we transform the food, I kind of takes them out of this game and everything. But I wonder what it would take like. What is that transforming an original reaction of the concrete possibilities? It has to do with the authenticity of business and being in time. There's a ability to take them over and what is it in the end of the day. Exactly a transformation in an original way. And the neo-Kantian tradition, I should say, I mean, but really, I should say, it really didn't come to an end with Faust. Its latest representative is Habermas, who is once again appealing to transcendental principles of human nature. And this neo-Kantian tradition always tries to, Habermas is a typical example, always tries to put us before a dilemma. The dilemma is the following. Either you think of human action or choices as totally arbitrary, like the rolling of dice, or they have to be fixed rules on which you act. These rules may never be spelled out, but they have to be some kind of rules that determine how we choose. And there are only these two things. And I think the most plausible way to argue against that is to talk about art. But presumably we don't think that the artist who is trying to recreate it is either doing just things arbitrarily. If he does that, then he has a determinate reason for doing that. There are forms of art that rely on randomness as well. But still, that randomness is then deliberately chosen. Procedure. So art generally is not simply a closing of your eyes and you dip your brush somewhere in the paint and then you go to a canvas and you just go on. Right? That's the wrong model of artistic creativity. But the other model that the neo-Kantian offers us is the only alternative. I mean, that is all rule governed and rule checked also seems wrong because there is no rule book for art, right? And not even an unspoken one. And in fact, if there were, then if we could discover that, you know, Rembrandt really was following some kind of formula, feed into a computer, we can now make lots of Rembrandt paintings. At that point, Rembrandt would have lost, or that kind of painting would have lost interest for it. If it has interest for it, precisely controlled by as it is, not the determined following rule. So artistic work is think of typically as falling into that equation, right? That it's not arbitrary and it's not rule determined either. And clearly, Hegel model, right, as it is of other thinking, it's not very unhurried line of whole truth. Their model is typically the artist is somebody who is sort of both. The problem is that whether that is an appropriate and satisfactory for how human beings might perceive truth, how it might perceive content, right? From we might think making these three choices, which I never read, not blind, is appropriate when you stand in front of a stranger. But are they equally appropriate to stand in front of a stranger? Yes.
I mean, I was going to ask you sooner or later, making this point, because it's something I never understood. I think it's probably very important to explain it. This business is doing what's practically possible at the time, or disclosing the current practical possibility. Can you say anything with the art thing, casting light on that? How do you understand that? I don't know what to think when I read that. All sorts of things are practically possible.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think of it as the artistic paradigm as given as a story here. I mean, there is a whole history of art, and you can now go back, let's say, and you just decide what you want to do is paint nice romantic paintings. You want to be like Bierstadt, let's say. But that's really a misunderstanding of what is really possible here, because art history has proceeded beyond that. And your task is now to go on. You have to see yourself in terms of your moment or your generation. And the task of that generation is quite different from the task of another earlier generation. So in some sense, it's possible to paint a Bierstadt landscape now, but it can't be possible authentically anymore because it's not something which is possible for our generation.
Well, that means that certain tradition is got us to a certain place where some variations on it make sense and others would either be so far from it that they would make sense or so regressive that they would.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's what the reference to generation here means. I think this is a very important passage, you know, that it isn't just telling you about you have to identify yourself with your people and your community, but it's the people and the community in this special historical moment, right? That's what matters.
And that inheritance really is something important. It's not just whatever happens. What happens up to now, good as what enables us to have some range of what makes sense.
Yes. And of course, for Heidegger, and this is where I think maybe he is, he makes the task definite for himself, but also more problematic for us, is that the thing that we have to refer to ourselves back to is the early Greeks. So there's this whole long history, but we have to go back to the beginning. That's the important thing, and repeat the beginning, the inception in a new way.
But not to repeat it. So
not repeat it, but not to imitate it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Repeat it.
That's
the beginning.
Exactly. But then you ask yourself, well, why couldn't we, for instance, go back to the Middle Ages and now decide what we really ought to be is, given all the disturbances of the time, we ought to become Christians again, and that will solve the problem of crime and all these disturbances of society if we can get a feudal system back going, right? So why not? Why is that? Why the Greeks and why not the Middle Ages, right?
Because all the time for these possibilities have run their course, and it's no longer like your example.
Right.
The only thing the Greeks had, which hasn't been, so to speak, used, is a sense of clarity. That's something that we've got. got now. And it isn't sort of the Greek clearing we've got now, but our clearing. That the one thing that they were sensitive to, which is still happening, and which we could become sensitive to, which hasn't been. Something like that is the picture.
Yeah. But then the next question is, why does that matter, right? Why does this concern with the clearing matter? I think part of its answer is always, well, the Greeks are the inception, they are the beginning. But that's where it becomes problematic for me, because in what sense are the Greeks, or that particular era of Greek culture, the beginning, when we know there was Homer and there was prehistory and it goes back, into the darkness somewhere. So why is that the starting point that we ought to return to?
Well,
because the only one we can?
No, I think, now I have to say sort of what he thinks at this stage and what he thinks later. At this stage, that's where we Westerners became defined as the unique culture we are. And for other polytheistic cultures, like Homer and so forth. But we're the only culture that ever had a unified understanding of being. That's our destiny, that's our essence. And that's what his theory. He gives it up.
Yeah.
In the course, we're going to get to the point where he gives it up. Because in the end, you're right. I mean, why not go back to polytheism?
Exactly.
It does. But not yet. Let people talk. There's so many big questions for me.
Yeah.
I think maybe this works in very top already, but it seems on one hand that the reading passage on inheritance part of the possibilities are because the service is some kind of continuity. The inheritance development, and what it would be, and attunement to why it's been handed down. But there's other things that we make possible new beginnings have to be some trust. Whenever those possibilities, the authentic rest of the time would pick up, would only be possibilities that whose actualization would change everything. Opening the world. I mean, I think in this extreme sense. So that the kind of inheritance that I was talking about must be one that is in some way feels part over. It's available. Certainly is available to one. And because the one has done those inheritance, and he's trying to in this passage and elsewhere distinguish himself from those fallen the work of tradition work, heritage and inheritance work. So I'm going to stress on the what would be to present the factual possibilities that resoluteness, which would be a shock, be some kind of radical replacement of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. The true inheritance is the concern with being. That's what has to be uncovered and has to be worked through. But then, for me, the question at that point would be, what does this concretely imply, right? I mean, when am I doing this? When am I failing to do this in a concrete situation? So I'm Heidegger there in April of 33. Should I sign up for the Nazi Party or should I not? Am I going to get some guidance here, or is it just up to me? Does it then, at that point, become a rolling of dice? It's these two possibilities. That's the practical range of possibilities. But is there some telling which one it's going to be? He obviously thought there was. And that's where I have difficulty.
Did he think, I never heard of it before. Did he think the question for his generation was, are we going to have a new beginning or not? That would be very interesting. That would make that generation different than any previous generation.
Oh, I think it is.
Yes.
Yes, that's, yeah.
He never says it in so many words, because
He does in the Rectorat statement.
Yes,
Yeah, sure.
the new beginning,
Yes,
for the whole world,
yes, for the West,
the West,
for Germany.
really, and
Yeah.
Germany is the
Yes,
vanguard of the West.
exactly, yes.
Very special thing for this country.
Okay.
And they blew it.
Because the forgetfulness of being or the darkening of the world has now reached its extreme point. And
Right.
so this, yeah,
Well, and they chose the new beginning didn't work.
yes.
And that gives value to the right person.
And because Heidegger's analysis, it wasn't really truly original, right? Because it just tried to appropriate these ancient Germanic myths and imitated the Greeks, and it relied on sort of old-fashioned prejudices about anti-Semitism. So it really was a kind of assemblage of old beliefs and prejudices. It wasn't really a new beginning at all. And that's why I think in the Spiegel interview he says at one point, well, these people were much too primitive. Right? That was their problem, because they didn't really see the task that was at hand. And Heidegger saw it, but in some sense also failed with it. Yes.
The basic question of what we're talking about there and you do it as well. If that's
Yeah.
but what's kind of like the position we're in here, the artistic position, the visual seems like is this Heidegger's position like something you have to wait for the whole beginning, something beginning to happen and anyone can act this way, or is it something that an individual are also
Well, we have to not only work as individuals, but as a group, we have to also be our. So it's meant to be a communal project. It's a project of the generation, not just Heidegger project. It's a project. Surely there. Yes. Oh, you were.
Well, I was going to think something about the overall picture. I'm sure Hans is right that from Heidegger's point of view, the socialists were primitive in the sense of not original and had a lot of mixed up stuff. But the deeper truth, remember the inner truth and greatness, that's equally bad. He talks about the inner truth and greatness of the socialists, what they could have been doing. But turns out, when he finishes messing with his own text, that that's not important. He says it's a confrontation with global technology. And the other way that the Nazis failed is that by having total mobilization, which is in the text you're reading, they became the extremest form of the subject-object understanding of being. Far from new generation and new beginnings were just, so to speak, the artwork focusing the total mobilization, which was the problem. I mean, that's the only greatness they've got. When they're greatly wrong.
Yes. I think in 1935 he thinks they are greatly right.
Exactly.
But then he keeps slowly changing his mind, and he gets more and more negative picture of what each other is. But they are unique, and they have in some sense their own truth.
Right.
Such as their own truth.
I'll tell you something funny. Compromise and I debated this very text, the seminar. And at this point, when I said, when you see Hitler was ready to criticize the Germans, say the worst form of technology, it's just more German chauvinism. They're always in the vanguard. Now they're in the vanguard of idealism. Just make him.
Yes.
What was this new project and executed by Heidegger as he would have designed? What would it look like? What would this new beginning really look like? I mean, what would the Gnostics, for example, have accomplished?
That's a good question. I don't have any concrete answers. In these lectures, I referred to them shortly, these totally lectures of the 1940s. He said, 1942, he said, the Germans now have to become more German than they have ever been. But more fatherlandish than they have ever been, more patriotic than they have ever been. And what that means, he says, is we have to read more Hölderlin. And through Hölderlin get this access to the Greeks and then see that they have something else. And he takes up a line from Hölderlin where he says that the Greeks have the fire from heaven and the Germans their sense of order. And he said, well, you see, now we can understand what the task is. We have to bring to the Germans this sense of the fire from heaven, which turns out to be the question of being. And we have to kind of bring this together, combine this with a sense of order. They're making classifications and being very scholarly and academic and professorial. Once we can do that, then we have done what is now called for. So he withdraws, I think, to some extent into his professorial existence. Yeah, the task as a professorial.
Yeah, this ordering is so much later. The problem,
Yeah.
just the idea that it would be
Yeah.
ordered
Yeah.
is definitely technological understanding of being. You get that to that stage.
Okay.
It's the ordering of everything just for the sake of ordering. I mean, maybe
That's problematic. But ordering with the Greek fire from heaven, that's another example.
I don't know what it is, but I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
One promotion.
Thank you very much.